I have a bit of a cold this week, but I heard a fellow YouTuber had taken it upon himself to make some rather haphazard attacks against some of our own arguments, so I felt I just had to respond. Hopefully my voice can hold up.
Hey all. So, as an atheist, there are some arguments against particular gods that I obviously find compelling, but I don't want to get into those right now. Right now, I want to point out some of the worst arguments against God and why they're bad, even though some atheists still use them today.
Okay, fine. But why are we doing this?
If we want to have better arguments, we probably need to abandon the worst ones.
That's fair, but do we need to focus on the worst ones? Or can we instead work more on sharpening our best ones? When atheists start obsessing with going after our own low-hanging fruit, I suspect some level of self-aggrandizement is at work, or at least that they're stirring up internal drama within the community.
So, first off, how many times have you heard the question, can God create a stone so heavy he can't lift it? Usually when this question is posited, it ends in saying that if he can't lift the stone, he's not all-powerful, since he can't lift a stone, and therefore cannot do something that an all-powerful God should be able to do. And if he can lift it, he's therefore incapable of creating a rock that is too heavy for him to lift.
And I would say that's a pretty compelling logical bind. So what's wrong with it?
I've heard this argument countless times, and again, as an atheist, I think that every time someone cites this argument these days, I can hear the theist audibly roll their eyes from this end of my screen.
Have you considered that theists roll their eyes at every atheist argument? And that this is mostly just because they've conditioned themselves to reject anything that pushes back against their faith? So what are you getting at by trying to defend them?
The solution to this particular problem is very simple. Most apologists nowadays posit that the Christian God can do all things that are logically possible. It is not logically possible for God to fail, ergo, he cannot make himself fail by either creating the rock or being incapable of creating it. This does not strip this particular God of logical omnipotence, as that type of omnipotence in recent years has been redefined. We can't just brush this aside by saying that you're redefining your God, because by doing that, we're dismissing the fact that the argument for omnipotence has evolved. Our arguments need to evolve as well. This issue of omnipotence can have better arguments against it, but the rock-lifting one is old, unrefined, and, in my opinion, dead.
What? Okay, so let me get this straight. Basically, Christians have said that God is all-powerful, which means he should be able to do literally anything. But when confronted with the "can God create a rock" problem, which demonstrates that the very idea of omnipotence is illogical, they retreat into verbiage like, God can do anything that is logically possible. And, as Souris so helpfully did for them, they redefine what it means to be all-powerful in a way that sweeps the problem under the rug and basically, if you press the issue far enough, eventually shapes the definition of omnipotence around the biblical God's limitations. By the time it's finished, we're left with an area of linguistic ambiguity that allows Christians to hold to their idea of an all-powerful God on a day-to-day basis, while pocketing a definition of flaccid pseudo-omnipotence that they can wield whenever they're pressed by atheists. This is the oldest apologetic trick in the book, and it allows Christians to duck and dodge whenever they're called out on even the most blatantly inconsistent parts of their faith. Combating this issue of language is one of the most challenging and exasperating parts of dealing with Christians. So you can imagine my frustration when someone like Souris, the so-called skeptic here, not only falls for such brazen misdirection, but does half the theist work for them by articulating their bullshit. Also, he can make himself feel smarter by dumping all over our own arguments. Seriously, I used to like this kid, but you have to wonder what the is wrong with him, and...
Hey Zod, what are you up to?
Oh, Souris, what are you doing here?
Cosmo let me borrow his portal again, so I hopped over to here to see what you were up to, and were you just responding to me?
You heard that, huh?
Yeah, I kinda did.
Yikes, well, geez, I didn't mean for you to overhear me saying you articulated Christian bullshit and, asking what the was wrong with you.
Oh, well, by all means, my friend. What is it that you actually meant? Please, do tell.
Well, I just kind of take some issue with what you're saying about these bad arguments against Christianity.
What issue are you taking, out of curiosity? I've had these discussions with theists, Christians in specific, and found these issues to crop up time and again, especially the argument from the stone.
Okay, well, I get that the rock's so big he can't pick it up scenario isn't an open and shut argument against God, and I wouldn't try to use it as one. But it's still a meaningful illustration of the complexities and possible contradictions of omnipotence. And I don't get how you could just dismiss it as a bad argument.
That's because it is a bad argument when dealing with stronger apologetics. You have a whole series about addressing William Lane Craig, so you know the advanced apologetics are out there, whether we like it or not. Craig even has a video dedicated specifically to the argument from the stone, and moreover, it was a problem posited by theists for theists as a method of strengthening their own position. I wouldn't say that makes it a super strong tool in our arsenal.
Well, yeah, I'm aware of what we might call advanced apologetics, although they mainly seem to become advanced by more thoroughly obscuring bad ideas behind complex tricks of language, but wait, what do you mean when you describe this paradox as a tool in our arsenal? What do you think people are trying to do with it?
I think people try to use the argument from the stone as a gotcha statement to make at least most Christians realize the paradoxical nature of God. The problem is that there are very easy ways around it, and I addressed some of those in my video with Ocean. I think the argument is weak, and while I see it used as a type of gotcha, it really doesn't serve that purpose. I think it can be useful as a talking point, but in no way is it a catch-all argument that people seem to default to.
Interesting. Well, I can see how you'd be cautious against using this as an open and shut case for the inconsistency of God. After all, I guess what people mean by omnipotence can vary, and I know that there are apologetics to work around this. However, I still think most Christians hold to the idea that God can literally do anything without giving enough thought to what that means. To me, can God create a rock so big he can't pick it up is a good question to get them thinking about this. Does that sound fair?
That's fair if you're dealing with a theist who's never given the issue any thought. I can agree that it's a good starting point, but only really a starting point. It's not a defeater in any sense of the word. And if people start using it as an opener more often than as an open-shut argument, I think then we can agree on its application.
I'm still not sure we totally do, though. It seems like you're treating this as just an opening for philosophically ignorant, or maybe I should say philosophically casual Christians, and saying that beyond that it's a bad argument against omnipotence. But I think any idea of omnipotence, even those proposed by advanced apologists like Craig, is still rife with fundamental contradictions. You simply can't take the ability to perform a task, boil it down to an essential idea of power or ability, and dial that up to infinity without running into various absurdities. The need to eliminate logical impossibilities is only the first of the limitations that needs to be placed on omnipotence in order to make it work. And by the time you're done, I'd say it can be argued that it's no longer really omnipotence. I think this does pose a problem even for sophisticated theologians and apologists, and while I may be wrong on that, it seems dismissive just to label it as a bad argument. I guess that's part of what's frustrating me.
Well, that's where the idea of having a better argument comes in. The argument from the stone is, and always was, a method of refining the definition of omnipotence. As an argument, it's pretty base level, and that's why I personally find it can be dismissed way too easily based on the theists I interact with most often. I think tackling the issues of mixing the omni traits to be much more beneficial and useful than trying to tackle any one omni trait. For instance, the argument from the stone can force the shifting of the goalpost on the definition of God, but if you have an omnibenevolent God who's also omnipotent and omnipresent and omniscient, now you have a great contradiction for a God, because this type of God couldn't allow something like murder or rape in the world while maintaining the trait of omnibenevolence, or maintaining the other 3 omni traits for that matter. I personally find that to be a much stronger angle to approach attacking an omni-God from. For me, I would like the issues to be tackled from the strongest possible angle, and the rudimentary baseline angle only works on certain Christians, and even then, it can only get you so far until the deity is just redefined.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, you probably don't think the "can God create a rock" question is totally useless for bringing up possible contradictions in omnipotence. It's more that it's an overly rudimentary statement theists can retreat from by redefining God. Does that sound about right?
That sounds about right.
I can respect that. I personally think the way theists retreat only represents an ongoing redefinition of terms that they deserve to be called out on. But I guess whether that's the case, or whether it's important to pursue them on it, is really a judgment call that boils down to the fine details. But basically, you think there are much more effective ways of tackling omnipotence than just going after its internal contradictions?
Absolutely. I feel multiple omni traits together seems to have far more problems than just simple omnipotence.
It seems like your perspective on this is actually pretty reasonable. I agree that can God create a rock so big he can't pick it up is pretty basic, and I can also see how the knee-jerk reaction its wording evokes can make it counterproductive. When you say this is a bad argument, it doesn't seem like you're totally disagreeing with the way I use it. So except in the details, I honestly think we mostly agree here.
Well, this is awkward. See, I had already called in the hammer missile strike against all of Alaska in retaliation for your earlier comments, but now that we're seeing more eye to eye, if some of those fall around your house, just ignore that. You'll be fine.
No worries. Alaska is more than adequately prepared to knock that shit out of the sky. But I'm a little sad and greatly concerned that that's where your mind went. But I guess this is kind of the point, huh? Even if you hadn't really launched missiles at my house, this level of knee-jerk offense is totally unnecessary, especially when it's over what turns out to be relatively trivial points of how we argue. I have to admit that something ugly did rise up inside me when your video started saying that this, and what created God, were bad arguments. And I understand a few of your commenters had a bit of heartburn over this as well, didn't they?
Yeah, you're definitely not wrong there. I kind of expected that, though. In fact, there were even some comments, like this one, that tried to defend the notion that belief in God is actually a mental illness.
Oh, Jesus Christ. I wasn't even going to begin defending that one. I guess people really do get their hackles up when someone questions their arguments. So maybe the semi-fictional me in the opening sketch should have slowed down and taken a breath before I started ripping into like I did, huh? And I don't know, maybe I could have asked you to clarify what you meant? But what's your takeaway from all this?
Chinese. My preferred takeaway is Chinese. But no, seriously, I think that people need to take a moment to digest things before immediately running to defend their ideas. All ideas are left to be challenged, including mine. That's why we have channels. We put ourselves out there for better or worse because we have these ideas. When I see comments like this one, which basically says that humans can create this, why can God not do the same? They're just missing the point. Humans have created nothing. Zero. Zilch. We've built things. We've never created. Neither we nor any theist has witnessed any type of creation of matter. If you take a minute to think about what your opponent is saying, then that would be pretty clear.
So my understanding is that when you released the video I started responding to, you basically got dogpiled by a bunch of fellow atheists who angrily lashed out at your criticisms of these arguments. Is that a fair characterization?
It's fair, though, as I said before, it was not unexpected.
And why do you think they reacted the way they did?
Probably because we're human. Heck, I do the same thing sometimes.
I guess that's the thing, huh? We're all human, and as humans, we tend to be pretty tribal creatures. It's so tempting not only to group yourselves by things as silly as religion, or lack of belief in religion, but to identify with and take pride in certain arguments to the point that we become dogmatic about our association with them. Any criticism of an idea we hold dear can feel like an attack on us or our group. So while I hugely exaggerated my staged response to your video, it honestly did get a little bit of a rise out of me when I first watched it. Can God create a rock so big he can't pick it up, and who created God can be used as simplifications, but there are important ideas behind them, and they at least start to point to vital contradictions in the Christian mythos. These arguments are attacked over and over by theists looking to defend the consistency of God. So when I hear them criticized, on any level, my temptation is to dig in on their behalf and refuse to give an inch of ground. Fortunately, this was just a gut-level reaction for me, and I recognized that Souris was fleshing out details of these arguments on a somewhat nuanced level. His point was more about strategy and how these details work than about shitting on people's arguments. I think most of us who took the time to pause and ask questions about what he was saying, as I did in our clumsy little skit, would find that we agreed on most of what he was saying. And as far as we disagreed, it was on details that I hope we could disagree about respectfully. And in fact, I hope we can value how these differences of opinion make our discussion richer. When we can't do this, when we give in to our temptation to entrench ourselves and fight behind the banner of a labeled argument, then we can lose out on the meaningful examination and discussion of ideas that sets us aside from fundamentalists and defines us as critical thinkers. And, I'd argue, we're not that far from falling in lockstep behind packaged open and shut apologetics. I think that's something we can all agree we'd like to avoid. Oh, and also, I was right and Souris was wrong.
You do realize I can still hear you, right?